In the final months leading up to Dawn Trail's release, like many others, I took it upon myself to try and complete my first ultimate. At the time, I wasn't really interested in trying to clear Ultima Weapon or Bahamut, even though those are probably the best places to start. No, I wanted to clear the Omega Protocol Ultimate. Yeah, that's not exactly the best starting point, but my heart was genuinely set on it. I'll provide some more context throughout the video, of course, but just to give some credit where it's due, a big inspiration for this video, and honestly my goal to finish the fight in the first place, comes from Renon's The Raid That Fractured the Final Fantasy XIV Community. Link that in the description below if you've not already watched it. So thank you, Renon, for helping me motivate to push myself out of my comfort zone and suffer through countless hours of prog. Seriously though, I've really grown as a player in this time, and looking back on where I've come, even since my last My Advice to New Raiders video, I've really improved a lot. And sometimes I look back at some of my old footage and I think, wow, I really used to play like this? Oh no! It's been a journey, and after months of prog, on June 14th, 2024, I did it. And then I fell into the hardest Final Fantasy XIV burnout I've ever been in. Go figure. Ultimate raids are not easy. So I took a few months off to recover and reflect. A much needed break. Now at the time of writing, it's October, and I'd like to share with you my experience, my story with the Omega Protocol Ultimate. I want to share what Ultimate raiding is like for people who are newer to it or have just never tried it before, and how somebody with no prior Ultimate experience can become an Alpha Legend. Now, before I get too ahead of myself, I've tried time and time again rewriting this goddamn script to try and squish all the thoughts that I have into a watchable video. It always gets way too long. So this time, instead of discussing every single mechanic, I'm going to try and summarize the phases, talk about what makes them unique or challenging, what gives them identity, and give my input on what stood out to me while I was progging it. In addition to this, I want to talk about what I believe the theme of this fight is, and what makes it stand out narratively, as well as mechanically, from the other Ultimates. This fight is a monster of an encounter, and many groups and players, myself included, were not ready for its difficulty on release. Nevertheless, like any encounter in this game, it can be conquered. And it has been. Many times. While the Ultimate raiding scene may be a very small part of the overall player base, there is a reason so much time and effort and energy is dedicated to crafting these fights every single expansion. Ultimate Raiders are some of the most dedicated, passionate, and at times borderline insane players this game has to offer. And at the heart of it lies a burning desire to overcome seemingly impossible odds, to break your IRL limits, so to speak, and achieve victory in what must be the most extreme of circumstances. Yep, let me tell you, those final victory cutscenes at the end of it all, those ones we've all watched on YouTube, they hit way different when it's your character on screen. So this one's for you Raiders, and for those of you who have been eager to try. Phase 1 consists of two mechanics, Program Loop and Pantocrator. Now on their own, neither of these mechanics are particularly complicated, but there is one design theme that ties them both together. Randomness. Put very simply, Program Loop is a series of towers and tethers that need to be taken in a specific order. Similarly, Pantocrator is a set of stacks and spreads that also need to be taken in a specific order. Granted, for Pantocrator there's a bunch of baited AoEs and rotation flames and whatnot, but at its core it is just a stack and spread mechanic. The thing that ties these two mechanics together is the ordering. When the cast bar finishes, Omega will assign these numbered inline debuffs, 1 through 4 and paired together. So for example, there will be 2 1s, 2 2s, 2 3s, and 2 4s. Hidden in these debuffs is the order that these stacks and spreads, or tethers and towers, need to be taken, with each player having a specific role. The problem is that these debuffs are assigned completely randomly every single pull. There's no role priority, no DPS and support pairs, it's just pure random. Which means your order in each of these mechanics can change pretty drastically. You'll notice this as a running theme throughout this fight. These inline debuffs are also assigned uniquely per mechanic, so your inline order for Program Loop might be completely different than your inline order for Pantocrator. Casters in particular, and to a much lesser extent melees as well, will need to be able to adjust their rotations based on what specific debuff they get assigned each pull. Your movement can vary drastically, and the difficulty in this phase doesn't necessarily come from the complexity of the mechanics themselves, but the sheer amount of variety between each pull and learning consistent movement and rotation habits across dozens of different patterns. In a lot of ways, this is notably harder for Pantocrator as it is much faster than Program Loop, but Program Loop itself is a mechanic that you will also wipe time and time again to. Playing as a samurai in this encounter, my rotation is flexible enough that I was able to make some small adjustments based on whether I would get second, third, fourth in line, etc. And even if my entire rotation wasn't altered that much, being able to make small adjustments per pull to accommodate for positional changes, as well as just finding the time to get away with casting a Madare, meant there was a lot for me to work on with my rotation. This entire phase is just shy of 2 minutes long, and you will spend a lot of time in here, just getting used to the motions and movements, learning to optimize your damage, as the DPS check in this phase is surprisingly tight. While repeating these same 2 mechanics over and over and over again can get pretty mind-numbing, this phase is a very solid introduction for the rest of the fight, and will help you practice getting used to adjusting, paying attention to debuffs, learning dozens of different movement routes and patterns. Look, say what you will about all the looper wipes, but nothing really gets you to start thinking about this fight like Phase 1 does. With enough practice, you'll be able to naturally adapt your rotation for every possible variation of looper. Casters, you will feel this nuance the most by far. Depending on which debuff I received, I would hold onto or spend my Madares slightly differently, delaying their usage a GCD or 2 by offsetting my combo, and utilizing the increased cast range to bias outwards, making my tether a little bit safer for the rest of the team. Depending on the job you play, there's potentially a ton of nuance to this phase, and even if you spend a lot of time just wiping to these first 2 minutes, there's still plenty of things to practice and work on when prog is slow. After you defeat Beetle in Phase 1, Omega will then split into male and female clones. While this phase consists of a couple of mechanics, Party Synergy and Limitless Synergy, the majority of this phase's difficulty comes from Party Synergy. After a Tank Buster from each clone and a couple of GCDs for some 2-target cleave, they will begin to cast Party Synergy, and in my opinion, this is pretty much the epitome of a top mechanic. This is also the most fucked up spread into stack mechanic I've ever seen, and it's fast. Really fast. The boss will go untargetable, then randomly assign PlayStation markers above each player's head, randomly assigning either a mid-glitch or remote glitch debuff. Then, on a random cardinal or intercardinal, it'll spawn this giant Omega Eye that will shoot a laser right through the arena. Random clone spawns will do one of 2 cleaves based on if they're male or female, and based on the weapon they're holding. Then spreads will go off on each player, killing anyone who's either too close or too far from their tethered partner, and then each player needs to get knocked back into a safe spot while being at the right distance for 2 4-person stacks. This mechanic is hard, and I think summarizes most of what Top's design is about. The mechanics in and of themselves are not that complicated. I mean, it's just a spread into stack, but the variation and the speed of everything is what makes it so challenging. The other problem, like so many mechanics in this fight, is that not a single player is allowed to make a mistake. If one player messes up, gets clipped by something they weren't supposed to, or spreads just a little too close or too far, or just knockbacks wrong, you're gonna wipe. Mid-glitch in particular can feel very finicky compared to remote glitch, and it took me and my groups a lot longer to prog. This shit sucks, honestly, and I would argue that this is the first major wall of the fight. Initially during my prog, I really struggled with the speed of this mechanic. It's very difficult to process everything you need to do, as the whole mechanic takes place in a little bit over 20 seconds, start to finish. This fight is very front-loaded, and party synergy is kind of the icing on top there. Most groups will spend many lockouts on just these three mechanics: program loop, Pantocrator, and party synergy. And even when you're finally progging ahead to Phase 3 and onwards, you're still gonna wipe to these mechanics, and sometimes frequently. There's just so much variation, and if one person in your raid group makes a single mistake or dodges just a little too slow, you wipe. End of story. Post-party synergy is basically free though, especially for DPS. There's a couple of tank tethers and beta dodges, but instead of doing any actual mechanics, the raid cheeses spread meteors with mitigation. Thank you tanks and healers for your service. From here, it's just a long DPS check, which brings me to another point. The constant DPS checks are one of the biggest differences between Savage raids and Ultimate raids. In older Ultimates, the DPS checks themselves aren't too tight nowadays, at least most of the time, but you still do need to do enough damage between each phase. In newer Ultimates though, these DPS checks are tight. Even towards the end of Endwalker, while the DPS checks were more lenient than they were on release, they were still very tight, and you need to put in work to clear them. This makes the actual role of a DPS feel much more impactful in a raid. You need to plan your rotations specifically around each phase, which also means knowing when to hold and burn excess resource, and even knowing when to hold kill time on a phase. Eventually, you'll get a sense for when you're ahead or behind in DPS on each phase, and knowing this, you'll be able to start making more decisions about spending or holding. These decisions become much more nuanced than they are in a full uptime environment like Savage, where there's usually just one correct answer to do the most damage. And after all of this, as a Samurai player, I've come to the conclusion that, in my opinion, Samurai is way more fun in Ultimate environments. Samurai has a lot of layers to its damage, with Kinky, Sen, meditation stacks, even the specific combo GCD you're on, and planning around specific uptime and downtime factors can become extremely nuanced. There are near endless decisions you can be making about what to spend and where. Hell, you even need to think like a caster at times, planning your movement very carefully around your busy 2-minute windows. Now, naturally this doesn't compare to planning an actual caster, but this was something unique to my job that I had to think about and plan around. It was honestly really overwhelming at first, but I kept sticking with it and studying and optimizing between wipes whenever prog was slow. To my knowledge, there's never been a dedicated Samurai rotation guide for this encounter, so the rotation that I built for myself became very personalized. I made decisions in my kit that I felt was right for my group, my team comp, and even if my rotation wasn't fully optimal, it was my rotation. And to me, that's really important. More so than any other fight I've done, top really allows you to showcase job mastery, and I really felt like this fight allowed me to showcase my Samurai. Finally, after breaching the DPS check, you have a funny little transition sequence, and then you're formally dropped into Phase 3. The majority of Phase 3 consists of Hello World. Hello World will deal heavy raid-wide damage and absolutely spam you with debuffs, but trust me, it isn't nearly as scary as it looks. After the cast finishes, each player will have like half a dozen debuffs assigned to them, and as a party we're essentially just trying to decode these debuffs and figure out how to use them to resolve the mechanic. Most of the challenge from this mechanic lies in understanding what you're supposed to do, and nowadays there's enough guides out there that you can just kind of figure that out on your own time. Figuring out what you're supposed to do in this mechanic is a lot harder than actually doing it, and once you've kind of cracked the code, it's really not that bad. Especially considering the amount of time you have, because this mechanic is literally like 2 minutes long. This is pretty much the closest thing you have to a breather period for this fight. Once you know the order of everything, this mechanic kind of just becomes a traffic simulator, and I don't want to say the whole phase is easy, because it is easy to mess up, but you have plenty of time to figure out where you need to be going, and as soon as one person makes the call out, red is defamation, or blue is defamation, that one callout is enough for you to be able to know where you need to be for the rest of the mechanic. Now, all that being said, the major difficulty of this mechanic isn't really so much from Hello World itself. The challenge is, this is a very movement-intensive mechanic that happens over a very long period of time. The DPS check of this phase is tight, and you need to plan your burst windows properly around it. Some jobs won't have too much difficulty with this, but most notably casters really need to have their movement figured out here. There's not really any way around it, you just need a lot of practice in this phase over and over to get it down and get it consistent. I'm not entirely sure how powerful Pictomancer is in this fight now that Dawntrail's released, though I do have my assumptions. But in Endwalker, Summoner was overwhelmingly the dominant caster pick for this fight. Its damage output was solid, and its ease of movement was way beyond any other caster. Black Mage was no doubt very powerful in this encounter last expansion, but you really had to know your stuff with the job to do well. And my impression was that Red Mage was decent in this fight, but Summoner's damage output was just far more accessible, and there was no practical reason to have a res on a caster when 99% of deaths will spiral into a wipe anyways. The skill investment required between casters has already been a pretty big talking point between the community, but an ultimate encounter like this really pushes it to its extreme. After concluding Hello World, the boss will begin to cast Critical Error, and this is a raid-wide that will essentially just kill you if you didn't do Hello World right. Following Hello World will be Oversampled Wave Cannon, and this is the mechanic with monitors. These are debuffs that Omega will assign to players in addition to doing one himself, and after a delay all of these monitors will be fired off, and we need to make sure exactly 2 players are being hit by every single one. Just like in Hello World, the start of this mechanic happens right around a 2-minute window, which means some movement can be a little bit tight, and the 3 players with the monitors, which are of course randomly assigned, need to face in very specific directions so as to only cleave a specific pair of players. This either means you need to time your GCD appropriately at your own risk, or accept a GCD or 2 of downtime and face away from the boss safely. Since this is a tough DPS check on this phase, some players will be inclined to greed. Do so at your own risk. The more you practice this phase, the more comfortable your group will be with their damage, and soon this DPS check will feel easier and easier. At about this point in the fight is when you'll really start to notice if your group is ahead or behind in damage. Carrying in more resources from phase 2 to phase 3 and optimizing your pot window is by far the most effective thing you can do to make this check easier. Being able to do this, however, requires being comfortable and consistent with phase 2 as well, and you can kind of just go backwards from there. Group damage output is going to vary drastically based on your team comp and the actual players you have on your team. And as a DPS, it is first and foremost your responsibility to figure this out and make the DPS checks as clean as possible. From a progression perspective, this doesn't always mean doing the most damage. If you know the DPS check of one phase is very achievable, you can plan around killing the boss as close as possible to its enrage timer to give you and your team more time for cooldowns to come back and to build job gauge. While it's a little bit difficult to get this in environments like Party Finder, this is borderline expected in statics. The traditionally selfish DPS jobs have the brunt of this responsibility, as we don't have any raid buffs to contribute to the team, so you need to make sure you know your shit. Push damage where it's needed, pool resource when you can get away with it, and make sure you play under your team as best as you can. Over time, this will become easier and easier, and personally, I think this is the most important skill that I got from this fight. From here though, it's on to phase 4. This phase is short, relatively simple, and requires you to bring Omega below 20% HP before it finishes its cast of Blue Screen. I think many players would probably consider this to be the easiest phase of top, and while I wouldn't necessarily disagree, that does not mean you should underestimate this phase. The only mechanic here is Wave Cannon, which is a full party spread into 2 randomly assigned light party stacks, which will then repeat 3 times in total. While maneuvering to resolve both stack and spread, Omega will launch expanding ground AoEs on the ground, and you'll recognize these from the phase 3 transition. There are some very mean timings between the AoEs on the ground and the stack lasers from the boss though, so study up and move carefully. A lot of players like to jump the gun on this phase as it's probably the easiest phase mechanically, honestly, but just because it's a little bit easier does not mean it's free. Like everything prior, this phase needs to be consistent, and if your party has fallen behind in damage on the earlier phases, now is the time when you need to make up the difference. This is a tough healing and DPS check, and since the DPS check here is so tight, you'll usually want to spend either a melee LB3 or 2-minute raid buffs. The decision here is a little bit comp dependent, but from my experience it's standard to send 2 minutes again at the end of phase 3, and then use the melee LB3 for phase 4. Ultimately though, so long as you bring the boss below its health threshold, it doesn't really matter too much, just kill the boss. The entire phase as a whole is just under a minute long, so you really won't be spending a lot of time in here. While I have heard some stories about how difficult this DPS check was on patch, from my experience with the fight in Endwalker, it was pretty achievable, honestly, with 635 dungeon gear and whatnot, and I imagine jobs like Pictomancer have only made this easier. Watch your movement, watch for the stacks, adjust if necessary, do enough damage, and congrats, you're on to phase 5. Yep, this is the big one. This phase is absolutely miserable, and is easily one of the worst things to prog in the entire game. We'll see if Futures Rewritten manages to top this, but as of now, I don't think there's many people that would argue otherwise. Narratively, this entire fight is an exploration of Omega trying to understand your strength, constantly shifting and changing its forms to mimic your power, once again standing on death's door, all of its usual tricks having been exhausted. In a stroke of desperation, it decides, no, I cannot give up. I must see. And just like that, it clicks. Omega has found the answer, the so-called indomitable human spirit or whatever. And now it's your turn to step up on stage and prove your worth. Phase 5 is the trios phase, which is to say there are 3 high-intensity, mostly downtime mechanics, with tank busters and raid wides layered in between. These raid wides hit hard, and they will one-shot players if they are not mitigated properly. Naturally, this will result in a raid wipe, so DPS, please use your MIT buttons, it is required. From this we have Run Dynamis, Delta, Sigma, and Omega. These mechanics all require perfect resolution from the entire party, while also juggling an additional mechanic. By the end of the phase, every single player needs to obtain exactly 3 stacks of Quickening Dynamis. This is required to clear phase 6. Every single one of the mechanics in this phase could use a video on its own about how to resolve it, and by the time you're done progging it, all of this will just kinda start to blur together. Blues to Beatles, mid-glitch, remote glitch, mid-A to close D. The callouts will just become automatic in your brain, pull after pull, brushing through the motions faster and faster and faster. All I can say is, at least the DPS check is forgiving. This phase is where burnout will really start to set in. All it takes is one mistake by any player during any mechanic, raid wipe. Now of course this can happen at any point in the fight, but it gets a little bit more draining when you're 10 or so minutes into a pull. Players need to be consistent with the first 4 phases to even see here in the first place, and straight up, this phase alone has been the bane of so many statics. Please try and be patient with yourself and others. Nerves can and will become a real struggle, so try your best to stay calm and focused. You made it this far, you got this. The difficulty of progging this phase really cannot be understated. While of course it feels bad to wipe 10 minutes into a pull, this also opens up another element of difficulty. As you need to spend 10 minutes to get to this point in the fight, that means your opportunities to actually prog the mechanics are very limited. I mentioned earlier in this video that top is very front-loaded, it is even more so back-loaded. In the span of one single lockout, you can prog Pantocrator, Program Loop, even Party Synergy dozens and dozens and dozens of times. But since lockouts are notably 2 hours in length and you need at least 10 minutes to even see Phase 5 Delta, you can't prog this mechanic, best case scenario, more than 12 times in a single lockout. I'm gonna give you a little hint though, you're gonna need more than a dozen times to prog every single one of these mechanics. It's just how it is. There are plenty of great high-quality video guides to help with your prog, but understanding what you need to do is different from actually doing it. Whereas a mechanic like Hello World in Phase 3 is pretty easy to resolve as long as you understand what you're doing, that's not really the case for Phase 5. These mechanics are complex to understand and difficult to perform. At the very least, the DPS check of this phase is still pretty lenient. The most important point to do damage is immediately following Run Dynamis Delta, which is the first trio. If you decide to use your pot at the beginning of Phase 3, then it'll come off cooldown around this time. Using it at this time allows you to get another pot at the beginning of Phase 6, so a lot of groups will naturally hold 2-minute windows for this pot window. At the end of the day though, most groups are going to spend weeks, if not months, progging literally just this phase and cleaning up everything prior. This phase is Omega's challenge to you, to your determination as a player. No matter how draining or frustrating this phase is, it is clearable. There's no real secret behind it, you just have to put in the hours over and over and over until it works. The question isn't, can I do this? It's, do I really want to do this? Is this worth my time at this point? Do I really want to keep going wipe after wipe after wipe to try and clear this? Is that totem really worth it to me? Is that title really worth it? Do I really want to do this? And then somehow, after who knows how many pulls, it happens. Let me tell you, after all the times I'd seen this cutscene watching different clear POVs, seeing it for the first time myself was something else. And what a morale boost it was too after the slog that P5 becomes. Congratulations. No, seriously. You've made it to Phase 6. But it isn't over yet. Phase 6 of Top is, mechanically speaking, pretty straightforward. But what Phase 6 is tight. Strict, punishing, nearly any stray mistake almost guarantees a wipe. While this phase on its own isn't too rough for DPS, tanks and healers get the brunt of the difficulty, and if you're playing Scholar or Sage, you have my condolences, as Barrier Healer specifically is undoubtedly the hardest role to play in this entire phase. As the transition cutscene draws to a close, the final fight begins. Just one last effort. So, to answer the question, why the Omega Protocol? The piercing rays of 10 million suns, the velocity of a worm surging across the cosmos, the flames which themselves incinerated the Dragon Star, the colossal impact which invites extinction. How do you, one who is so small and insignificant by comparison, hope to win? You who were ranked among the most feeble of species, you who demonstrated incomprehensible strength in defiance of all logic. How can you possibly hope to succeed? This fight is a question turned challenge. Why are you here, and how can you possibly hope to defeat me? Phase 6 is no joke. While the mechanics themselves are relatively simple, the damage to the raid is extremely high, and even one missed mitt at the wrong time can be the difference between a player living or dying. Exasquares, party stacks, spreads, scrambling Mario Kart style around the entire arena as a group, desperately clinging to life. And the secret mechanic of this fight is attached to the Dynamis buff we all received from Phase 5. Every player in the raid will need to limit break at least once. Now, despite being the final phase of this fight, You are probably going to wipe here over and over and over again. This phase is not a victory lap, and every single time, every wipe, Omega's grating lines digging into you. Why are you still here? Time and time again, wipe after wipe, you persevere. And for what? After the hours and hours and hours of progging through hell, once you finally breach that threshold of Phase 6, Alpha Omega, as you're barraged with mechanic after mechanic, desperately dancing the line between life and death, you are asked, no, demanded, every step of the way, why are you here? The piercing rays of 10 million suns, the velocity of a worm. The question is no longer how, but why. Why are you here, at this precipice of greatness, this journey's end, where any small mistake could threaten and end the entire run? Despite every wipe, despite every mistake along the way, despite every crippling defeat, every single sleepless night, why are you still fighting? Look, I'm not the best at the game, and I'm not the smartest at figuring out new mechanics. I'm not the quickest to resolve them. I'm not the best at my job, and I have anxiety. There's always that little voice in my head, nagging at me, trying to tell me that I'm not good enough, that I don't belong here. But despite that, I had the drive to keep pushing myself forward. The drive to allow myself to fail, and fail I did, so I could learn to grow and improve and eventually thrive. Striving to keep pushing forward purely because I wanted to believe that I could. And maybe you're looking at this and thinking, dude, it's just a game. It's not that serious. And you're right, honestly. At the end of the day, it's just a raid in a video game that has no bearing over my life pretty much at all. But for so many of us, that's kind of what life is about. Finding our own small ways to give meaning to our lives. I gave myself a goal, a challenge that seemed impossible, that at the time I thought I had no way of achieving. Trying again and again and again until magically, somehow, everything goes just right. Holding on to the hope that you can until finally, after all this time.
Oh my god. I'm free. I'm free. I'm free. We did it. We did it. We did it. We did it! I'm fucking free! I'm fucking free! It's over. It's over. Oh my god. Oh my god. No. It's... It's done. I actually fucking did it. I actually fucking did it. It's over. Oh my god. Oh, fuck my life. Oh. Oh shit. Oh.
did it. I actually did it. Oh my god. Oh. 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 It's over. I did it. I actually did it. This fight has been a fucking journey for me. I gave up on it shortly after my first attempt, deciding that I just wasn't good enough. And yet, more than a year later, I wanted to try again. And after countless evenings spent progging, subbing for groups, even running out of time to clear with my static before turning around to clear in Party Finder with complete strangers, I did it. I cleared the Omega Protocol Ultimate, and having it finished, finally done, I just ran off to Rods at Han and got that stupid ass sword I've been wanting for so long. A reminder to myself of what it took to get here, how far I've grown, and the irrefutable, undeniable proof to myself that I did it, that I am capable of achieving my goals. And so, to that, to you viewer who have for some reason made it this far, please don't give up on yourself. Of course, learn to be kind to yourself and be patient, but please, please don't give up on yourself. Because given enough time and space and determination, we are all capable of achieving incredible things wherever that may be in life. Thanks for watching, and till next time.